We're in Romans chapter 2, verse 1. And we heard in chapter 1 that the Gentiles were without excuse, without excuse in their idolatry, without excuse in their practice and service to their God. Now, their God, they had made Jehovah small. They had made him what he is not. They had made him a man or a bird or a beast or a bug. They're still doing that today. Ask Murney whenever he went overseas. But in chapter 2, he now turns his attention to the Gentile, to the Jews. He's been talking about the Gentiles. But Paul's going to say something quite surprising to most Jews of that day and time. So let's read the first 4 verses. Wherefore thou art without excuse, O man, and that is the Jew. Verse 16. Whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. For thou that judgest dost practice the same things. Verse 2. We know that the judgment of God is according to truth against them that practice such things. And then in verse 3, reckonest thou this, O man, who judgest them that practice such things, and doest the same thing, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? Now, here's what you noticed in this reading. Number 1, I'm going to stop right there instead of 4. What you noticed in this particular reading is that there's a whole lot of judging going on. God does not condemn judging. God condemns hypocritical judging. He condemns judging another while you're practicing the same thing. He condemns false judgment. He condemns those who would judge unfairly, unjustly. He condemns every bit of that all the time. But to judge righteous judgment, John 7, is righteous, is good, is what God expects. That's what he does. We're going to see what all that entails. So he points out, thou that judgest another. He's talking to the Jew, and he says to the Jew, here's what you're doing. You're judging the Gentile. Other men can be included in that. But what he's talking about right now is judging the Gentile. You're making a decision religiously concerning the Gentile. But then he goes on and he says, thou that judgest, do you not realize that you're condemning yourself? Now, judging and condemnest are cousin words. Now, there's a better way to put that. Judges, carino, you're making a decision. Good or bad, you're making a decision. Kata carino, you're making a judgment against. You're making a decision against. In this particular text, the writers, the translators have made the phrase, you condemnest, because it is a negative judgment. The negative judgment is against themselves. Why is that? Verse 1, he says, for thou that make the decision, you practice the same thing. I find it quite interesting that here's what God has done in this text. Sometimes we develop a problem because we fail to realize there were no chapters, there were no verses in the first century, second century, third century, fifth century, ninth century, 11th century, and so forth. Those all came along later. So instead of separating chapter 2 from chapter 1, turn back with me to chapter 1, verse 32, and realize that it goes right along with this section of what we just read. So in chapter 1, verse 32, after making the statement that we just heard, we're now making a comparison. Speaking of the Gentiles, he said, who, knowing the ordinance of God, knowing the statutes of God, knowing the law of God, knowing the will of God. They knew it. They did not have to know the law of Moses to know the ordinance of God. The law of God had been given, the ordinances of God, the statutes of God had been given in the garden and had been given unto the fathers, the patriarchal age, among other things. And by the way, you had Jewish prophets. You had Jewish prophets that would go to the Gentiles and preach to them. Ask Nineveh, ask Jonah. So he says in chapter 1, verse 32, who knowing the ordinance of God and knowing that they that practice such things are worthy of death. They that practice such things. But not only do the same, but also consent with them that practice them. Now you may be reading in the King James the word do and doest them. The word practice means it's a habit, something they are involved in. It's a daily situation. It's a constant situation. So in chapter 1, 32, he has said that the Gentiles are practicing this. They know they should not be practicing this, and they know that they are worthy, suitable, appropriate unto death. They bring forth death. They knew those things. And so when he gets to chapter 2, verse 1, he says, you're doing the same thing. You Jews are practicing the same thing, but you're condemning those sins, those practices, and we studied those in verse 17 through verse 32. You're practicing exactly the same thing. Looking at chapter 2, he goes on concerning the idea of practicing. We know that the judgment of God is according to truth against them that practice such things. The judgment of God. He notes in verse 3, reckonest thou this, O man, who judgest them that practice such things, and doest the same, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? You won't. You can't. God is just. God is fair. God is holy. He judges, and he judges correctly. We notice in chapter 2, verse 2, we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against them that practice such things. The judgment of God is against those things, whether you are a Jew or a Gentile. The Gentiles agreed with that. The judgment of God is against those who practice the things that we outlined in chapter 1. I called your attention a moment ago to verse 32, and I made a big issue of the point in verse 32, knowing the ordinance of God, and they that practice such things are worthy of death. The Gentiles, not only agree that that's God's law from God, they agree that they are suitable, appropriate unto death. But they practiced them anyway. We take notice that the Jews agree with the assessment. When it comes to judging the Gentiles, the Jew says, yes, Gentiles, you are correct to conclude and to agree with God when you practice those things. It's against the law of God and it's worthy of death. But they fail to realize they're talking against themselves. They're condemning themselves. Some people just fail to realize the principles that they are setting up for other people to follow. They fail to follow those same things. This particular principle of someone agreeing with a law, but failing to apply it to themselves, caused me to think of the things that I've been looking at over the past month, 2 months, concerning the atheist and the agnostic. He agrees with the law of God, and then he disagrees with the law of God when he starts applying it to himself. The atheist cries against God and says, God is immoral. God is wicked because sin exists. Time and again, you will hear that's one of the major things that the atheists and agnostics say. Look at all the wickedness. If God were really good, he would remove all of this wickedness. See, God is bad. I need to first of all recognize when God first created the world, there was no evil, no wickedness present. There was no pain. There was no suffering because there was no sin. What did God do in the very beginning with Adam and Eve? He created a perfect place for them, and they had a perfect body, and they had things that were going exactly right. They moved away from God. They left the will of God. They left the good of God and the love of God and steeped themselves, steeped the world into sin. Now, I guarantee you, they didn't know what was going to happen when they partook of the fruit. You ought to hear the atheists make fun of that fruit. I've called your attention to Schoenig back in the 70s, 80s, 2000s. Schoenig, who was an atheist and debated laws down at Texas, he said, God should have destroyed Hitler when he sinned. God did wrong. It was horrible of God to do evil against Adam and Eve. Schoenig has no idea. Adam and Eve had no idea that they introduced sin into the world. Turn with me to Romans 5:12, please. Did they introduce sin? That's not what I said. It's important for the atheist to hear. Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world. Yes, I know that Satan said some things to them, but if they hadn't transgressed, sin would not be in the world. Here's Romans 5, verse 12. Therefore, as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, spiritual death through sin, and so death, spiritual death, passed unto all men, for that all sinned. The reason death, spiritual death, passed unto all men is because all men have sinned. That's what Paul is saying, and all the sin came into the world through Adam and Eve, Genesis chapter 3. So God created things the way they ought to be created. God did what the atheist wanted. What a perfect world. What a good world. No pain, no evil. It's not God's fault that Adam and Eve would transgress. God is horrible to condemn the Canaanites and to have called for total elimination of all that dwelt in the land of promise. That's what we hear. Now listen. God should not have evil in the world. It's immoral of God to have evil in the world. God should not have killed all of the Canaanites. That's just the opposite. The Canaanites, the promised land, they were very wicked, and they were full of disease because of their sin. Let me quote to you Richard Dawkins, who makes the statement. The Bible story of Joshua's destruction of Jericho and the invasion of the promised land in general is morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacre of the Kurds. Richard Dawkins says God is just as bad as Hitler. Why? Because he went into Canaan and he killed those people. Wait a minute, you're accusing God of being evil because he allows sin. Then you accuse God of immorality when he removes sin. Which is it? Well, to the atheist, the agnostic, it's whatever they want at the moment. It's whatever argument they're making at the moment. I want you, if you would, to turn to Leviticus chapter 18, and you will see the sin of the Canaanites. Leviticus 18, we're going to start in verse 6. I will be skipping, so skip with me. I'll say skip, and see if you can see the point that I'm making. What Moses is writing is concerning the sins of the Canaanites before Israel goes into the land. None of you shall approach to any that are near of kin to him. Approach is have intimate relationships with. Verse 7, the nakedness of thy father, the nakedness of thy mother, thou shalt not uncover. We understand that without me going into details. Verse 8, he speaks of thy father's wife. Verse 9, he speaks of the sister. This appears to be a stepsister or half sister. They're off limits to you. Verse 10, thy son's daughter. That's a granddaughter. Or thy daughter's daughter. That's a granddaughter. I do not need to go into the specific details of the sin that they are committing, the incest that's going on. Verse 11, thy father's wife's daughter. Verse 12, thy father's sister. Verse 13, thy mother's sister. Verse 14, thy father's brother and his wife. Verse 15, thy daughter-in-law. Verse 17, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. You can see the sins that are being committed, and a lot of these sins are headed towards the point of sexual transgressions, fornication. Of course, we saw that and we recognized that when we went through the book of Corinthians, and they had a temple 300 feet in the air with 1,000 prostitutes in which they would worship God, male and female prostitutes all over the Gentile world. Well, during the days of the Canaanites, 1500 BC, they had the same problem. When you have such intimacy between the family and other people, you've got a lot of disease going on, and they did. We read further in verse 19. Defile not that yourselves in any of these things, verse 20, and thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife to defile thyself with her. Thou shalt not give any of thy seed to them, thy children, to them that pass through the fire of Moloch. Idolatry. Neither shalt thou profane the name of God. I am Jehovah. Some of these atheists that I've been watching, before 600 people, they lambast God. Verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Thou shalt not lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereof. So you can see the word fornication being pointed out in the bestiality, in the homosexuality, and in the adultery. And we've defined that fornication is the general word, and these others would be the categories underneath the idea of fornication. You will also take note, this is the one that just drives me crazy. Verse 21, thou shalt not give any of thy seed, thy children, to make them pass through the fire of Moloch. Verse 24. Defile not yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out from before you. Canaan. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it. 26. Ye therefore shall keep my statutes. That's the positive side. And my ordinances. And shall not do any of these abominations. That's the negative side. And he started in verse 6, naming those negative things. 28, that the land vomit not you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nation. Verse 30, therefore shall you keep my charge, that you may practice not, that ye practice not any of these abominational customs which were practiced before you. We have the same customs today that people will go on national TV and brag about keeping. But God would condemn those things. Archaeology has done a great good in helping us to see more what the Bible has to say concerning the children of Israel. Well, in the land of Canaan, in the land of promise, they have done some digging at Bezer or Bazar, whichever way you want to pronounce it, which is just north of Jerusalem somewhat. It's on a mount, and as you fly over it, and they've got it now cleared off, you can see large stones. The next stone is not quite as large, 10 feet away, and the next one not quite as large, and the next one not quite as large, sticking up in the air. And in front of these stones is about a 4x4 stone pit. And in the middle of the pit is an opening. And the archaeologists who dug in that area and dug those things up and did the research on it, when you get into this pit that looks to be about time and a half wider than a human being, so 2 feet by 2 feet, they found all sorts of bones of babies, of infants. Here's the way it reads on the website. A great number of bones of human beings in a confused heap. A young girl who had evidently been sawn asunder. The skulls of 2 other girls who had been decapitated. All around the feet of the columns. You remember I mentioned the columns? All around the feet of the columns, the skeletons of young infants. They were deposited in large jars. The skeletons showed marks of fire. This is not a place of worship to Jehovah. This is a place of worship to Moloch, the fire god. That's what was going on all over Canaan. So you have the transgressions as we read about. The New Atheists call God's commands to kill the Canaanites genocide, but a closer look at the Canaanites' sinfulness exhibited in rampant idolatry, incest, adultery, child sacrifice, homosexuality, bestiality. God's reason for commanding their death was not genocide, xenophobe, but capital punishment. We have to also recognize this. There are those who would say, why didn't God warn them? You might take note of Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. Genesis 15, 16. God had just proclaimed unto Abraham that he was going to bless his seed. Chapter 18, chapter 22 as well. But in this, it's a little different. It's not your servant. That's not the one we're going to bless you through. He says this, I'm going to give you the land. Chapter 15, 16. And in the fourth generation, your family shall come hither again to Canaan. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. Now take note with me this. You have the situation where God is talking to Abraham. I'm going to give you the land of Canaan, but not now. 4 generations. Now, by the way, a generation in that day and age was different than a generation today or a generation in the first century, because men lived to be 110, 175. So a generation in that day is approximately 100 years. So in 400 years or so, you're going to have the land, but not now. Why? Because the Amorites sin and their transgressions has not come to full. They're not as bad as they're going to get. What happened in Genesis 18? A few years after the proclamation of this prophecy, Bible students realize that in Genesis chapter 18, you have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah. You know that you have Canaan land, and south of Canaan land is the Dead Sea. A little bit south of that is Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed. When God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for their homosexuality and their incest, that was a pretty good warning unto the land of Canaan. They did not heed that warning. They became worse and worse. And so by the time that you have Moses, approximately 400 years after what God said to Abraham, you have Moses taking the children of Israel through the wilderness, and he would have gone directly into the land of promise, except for the children of Israel and their transgressions. So they paused for 38 years because of that transgression. 1 year for every day. And then Joshua took them into the promised land and captured Canaan, a land full of sin and disease. The atheist cries, God should have warned Canaan. He did. They cry, God should have warned Sodom and Gomorrah. He did. He said to Abraham, if there be 50, Abraham said, if there be 50. Well, God, if there be 40. Well, God, if there be 30, if there be 20, if there be 10 righteous, God says, I'll not destroy it if you can find 10 righteous. There were not 10 righteous. There were not 5 righteous. I have come to the conclusion that the atheist says, why didn't God do this? Why didn't God do that? Why didn't God do this over here? They're always disagreeing with the way God did something. You ever notice that? Always. Why doesn't God write the Bible this way? Why didn't God handle sin this way? Why doesn't God create the heavens and the earth this way? I'll say this. When you get to be God and you have all of God's knowledge and you have all of God's wisdom, then you get to do it your way. But I suggest if you were God, you would decide the same thing that Jehovah has decided. You just don't realize it because right now you're a human being. So we have these things that have gone on, and the atheist is doing the same thing that the Jew was doing. He that judgest another, thou condemnest thyself, because you're practicing the same thing that you're condemning in others. We take notice of verse 2. The latter part of it says the judgment of God is according to truth. By the way, before we go any further, let me call attention to this. Jehovah is a God of justice, long suffering, and compassion. You can see that with the land of Canaan. You can see that with Sodom and Gomorrah. You can see that with the flood. God is just. He's going to destroy sin. He's holy and just. That's what's going to happen. But what God will do is he will send out a message. And God waited in the days of Noah, 2 Peter chapter 3. The long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. Why weren't 3 million and 3 billion and 3 trillion people saved? Because they were wicked and they wouldn't listen. What God has done is extended his compassion and his mercy, but people will not accept it. Verse 2, the judgment of God is according to truth. In John 8:32, Jesus said, you shall know the truth shall make you free. John 17:17, sanctify them in thy word, in thy truth. Thy word is truth. John 12:48, John 12:48. He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my saying, said Jesus, hath one that judgeth him. The word that I spake, the same shall judge him in the last day. The word that I spake shall judge him in the last day. Turn back to Romans chapter 2. Looking at the last verse in the section that we're trying to cover. You will take notice in verse 16, Paul said, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men according to my gospel by Jesus Christ. Therefore, we're not going to be judged by the ignorant, the lack of knowledge, and inconsistent atheist and agnostic. We do not want men to be our eternal judge. We will not be judged by the Jew. He's inconsistent. He's has hypocrisy, practices the same thing. He's going to condemn in others. We do not want to be judged by our peers. They judge solely by what they think they see, what they think they see, but they do not know. They do not see all. Turn with me to Romans 14, if you would. Romans chapter 14, verse 10. But thou, why dost thou judge thy brother? Or again, why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, to me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess God. So then, each one of us shall give an account of himself to God. Look at verse 8 before you go back to chapter 2. Whether we live or whether we live, we live unto the Lord. Whether we die unto the Lord. We are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Chapter 2. In chapter 2, verse 3, he asked this question, and how do you answer it? Now I'm going to skip part of the verse so that you can see the question. And reckonest thou this, O man, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? Do you think, do you calculate, thou, O man, that's practicing what you're condemning in others, that you will escape from God's judgment? while on earth in Jerusalem and Judea. Jesus warned these Jews for 3 years. Matthew 23:33. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you offspring of vipers, how shall you escape the judgment of hell? Therefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you shall kill and crucify. Some of them shall be scourged in your synagogues and persecuted from city to city. Jesus, while on the earth, called them vipers, deadly snakes. And he says, but I'm going to warn you. I'm going to help you to see the truth. I'm going to send you prophets. I'm going to send you men who will warn and tell you what's going to happen and what you need to do to make things right. God has always had the compassion to warn people and to warn them sufficiently enough. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 25. See that you refuse not him that speaketh, for if they escape not when they refused him that warned them on the earth, Exodus 20, much more shall we not escape who turn away from him that warned from heaven. The Revised Standard says, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less shall we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. The destruction of Jerusalem in the first century stands as an analogy to the destruction of the souls in the last day. Paul writes to these same Jews in the same area shortly before their physical destruction that Jesus had warned them about, and he said this, Hebrews 2:1. Therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things that were heard, lest haply we drift away from them. For if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, the law of Moses, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which having at the first been spoken through the Lord, was confirmed unto us by them that heard? Those verses go together. How shall we escape? We're not going to. If we're going to act like the Jews that Paul is addressing, we will escape. Everybody, no one is left out, can escape from God's condemnation if we will do what verse 4 and following have to say. I invite you back next week.